Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform.
Welcome to our next episode of Conflict Stories podcast. We have a special guest with us today. I'm on Bundjalung country in Byron.
And I'm on Paramount country in the Adelaide Hills.
And our lovely guest today, Rabia, where are you joining us from today?
I am joining you from Wajak country in Perth, WA.
Very nice, thank you. And I'm going to throw to you, Sam, to introduce Rabia today.
I would be surprised if people didn't know who Rabia was. I'm delighted to welcome Rabia Siddique today to join us in the Conflict Stories podcast. Rabia is an international humanitarian lawyer, retired British Army senior officer, a former war crimes and terrorism prosecutor, and a hostage and trauma survivor. She's undertaken humanitarian aid work in Asia, South America, Europe, and the Middle East, and she was decorated by Queen Elizabeth II for her work. Rabia's got a best-selling memoir, Equal Justice, My Journey as a Woman, a Soldier and a Muslim, and it was published by Pam Macmillan in 2013. And she's now a multi-award-winning storyteller, inspirational speaker, leadership consultant, media commentator, non-executive director and human rights advocate. And peace, equity, and the sustainability of our planet is what drives her. And her biggest challenge and joy is being a mother to teenage triplet sons. What a handful.
I'm exhausted just listening to that introduction. Thank you so much, Sam. Great to be with you both.
Thank you, Rabia. And the first sort of question we always like to ask our guests is about their childhood. And it was interesting, we had Mimi Kwa on recently, and she was talking about her cross-cultural challenges and insight growing up with a Chinese father and an Anglo mother. And I'm aware that you grew up in Perth and you were the daughter of an Indian Muslim father and a Anglo-Australian mother. And really interested to know how that shaped you and what sort of conflicts were involved in your childhood and upbringing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess much like Mimi, I've had an upbringing where I've walked in two worlds, I guess is the best way to describe it. So I lived my early years in India. And in fact, English was my second language. My first language was Hindi, which is the national language of India. So in terms of some of my formative years, they were spent somewhere very different to Australia. And as I was approaching school age, Mum and Dad made the decision to migrate to Australia. And we arrived in Australia in Perth in the mid-1970s when some of those that are listening to this may remember the White Australia policy was still very much alive. And what that meant, I guess, for those of us that came from non-European foreign shores was that there was this expectation, sort of pressure to fit in. You might remember that assimilation was the buzzword back then, and we were basically told, check your differences at the door, fly beneath the radar, become invisible, assimilate, and then you'll be accepted into the community as new Australians. So I guess in those early years, I remember that being easier said than done for particularly Dad and me to a lesser extent. And I remember seeing the world very much through Mum and Dad's eyes, as you do when you're a child. And it was really clear to me that Dad came up against almost daily discrimination and prejudice and ignorance. And Dad seemed to handle it with good humour and with quite a bit of dignity. But, behind closed doors, it can be different. And I remember thinking that really there were a lot of wounds caused by those ignorant words and those harsh attitudes towards him. And I guess in a way, seeing Dad suffer like that and seeing the way he was treated by people around him it made me sad, but it also gave me a very early awareness and I guess the seed of what later became my passion and commitment for fairness, for equality, for social justice. And I suppose I had a challenging time as well. I was an only child for a while. Eventually, my little brother came along when I was 8, but we started life like most migrants in a pretty working class suburb. I went to a fairly rough and tough primary school. I arrived here with quite a thick English accent because I went to an international school where we were taught to speak the Queen's English in India. And I had, this funny name at a time when the Indian and certainly the Muslim community were almost non-existent here. And I had dark skin, and really the only other brown kids at school were the Aboriginal kids, and they were getting a really hard time. So that's something that really struck me as a little girl. And I guess from an early age, I learned to keep my head down and my hand down in class because, you put your hand up to answer a question and you're putting your head above the radar. And I learned really quickly that that was not something that I should do. So I guess it was challenging. Although having said that, I think it was the most profound gift my parents gave me was the gift of an upbringing and a life in Australia. I wouldn't have had the benefit and the blessings of all the opportunities that I had it not been for that. And, we've all won the lottery of life calling Australia home with everything that we take for granted and all the freedoms that we have that we don't have to think twice about. Yeah, we're truly very lucky. But back in those days, back in the 70s, I remember thinking it was mixed blessing. What were mum and dad doing? Because it was tough.
What motivated you to become a lawyer? Was it that background or something else? Did you have any heroes that you looked up to in that field?
I think what motivated me to ultimately decide on the law was probably that, having that start in life and having a very early awareness of what it feels like to not be treated as equal, to be judged by the way you look, the name you have, the accent you speak with. But I think ultimately what led to the law was a life-changing experience that I went through. So at the age of 9, I was sexually abused by our next door neighbour, who was like a granddad to me. And I was abused for a very long time. And for a long time, I kept my mouth shut because I believed that as long as I kept quiet, that I could protect my little brother from the same fate. And that went on for, I think, almost a year. And then eventually, when I realized that I couldn't protect my brother anymore and it was almost inevitable that he was going to be next, I spoke up and I told my parents. But again, times were very different. And, my parents spoke a lot about the shame and the stigma and the humiliation that this would bring on the family. And so a decision was made, which sadly wasn't uncommon back then, and that was to never speak of the abuse again. So it was swept under the family rug. The police were never called, and I was told never to speak about it again. And I didn't for a very long time. But I remember feeling, if I didn't feel different before, I felt more of a loner, more of an outsider than ever at that stage, and for many years afterwards, because I had this huge secret that I was harboring that was destroying me, that was eating away at me. And I guess never having felt justice at that time when I needed protecting and when I needed to feel a sense of justice and that the wrong that had been done to me would be righted, never having felt that, combined with my early awareness and passion for social justice and equality, led me to the law. I eventually found myself in an environment in my high school where I was accepted, I was embraced, teachers believed in me. It's the first time I felt like I'd ever belonged. And it was probably at that period, at a pivotal stage in my life, where I could have gone one of two ways. I could have let the abuse have completely defined me and destroyed me, or with the right environment, with the right support, I could turn into a positive legacy. And thankfully, that's what I did. So I decided that I wanted to commit my life to serving others, to helping others access justice, perhaps in a way that I felt that I hadn't. And that's when I decided that the law would be the vehicle through which I would realise this calling, really.
That's quite an amazing insight at that age to have that motivation, I guess, and that trauma that you'd been through, and to be able to focus it to helping others.
I guess really by the age of about 16, 17, I'd already led a very big life and somewhat challenging life. And so that led to big decisions. Um, I guess I didn't realize it at this stage, but many years on, I've come to realize that everything that happens to us is a gift, even if it's in pretty crappy paper. Eventually, we learn the lessons and um, hopefully get the growth and the development and the wisdom from it, because everything that happens to us, good and bad, makes us who we are, right? What's that saying? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
It sounds like if you have the right support and the people who believe in you and help you thrive, like in your high school.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam, you asked about whether there was any heroes that I had
Mm-hmm.
in the law at the time. No, not in the law. I think my heroes at that stage when I needed it the most were um, the school principal and the teachers that I had around me in high school, particularly those last couple of years, that believed in me and that embraced me and that saw something in me that I don't know if I had fully recognized myself. My passion, my drive, maybe my intellect, um, and and probably some leadership qualities. I was elected school captain, and I guess it was interesting because when I found out that I'd been nominated, I told my parents, who were thrilled for me. But I remember Dad sitting me down and trying to manage my expectations. The school I went to was a Uniting Church school, and he sat me down and he said, just be so proud and be happy with that, because it's very unlikely that this church school would be able to be so courageous to allow you to be school captain, from a Muslim family. It's unheard of. So when that happened, I guess that was a significant moment for me. And I think it was also a bit of a lesson for my parents in terms of not to constrain what was possible for me as their child, but for them as a family as well. And I think that very first taste of leadership and being given responsibility and believed in was pivotal and allowed me to make, a fairly early decision that I was going to follow a career in the law.
And how did you go from that to the British Army?
Yeah, it wasn't part of the plan. Um, I practiced law for a few years in Australia, mainly as a criminal lawyer and as a human rights lawyer. And I was so fortunate to work with some incredible people and communities, remote, regional, and Indigenous communities, asylum seekers and refugees, victims of family and domestic violence. And it was an incredible and steep learning curve. It taught me so much about humanity and suffering and injustice. Um, but around about that stage in my early 20s, there was this voice inside my head that was getting louder and louder. And eventually I realized that that was a voice calling me to even higher duties. And that was to practice as a humanitarian lawyer. So really to advocate for, to defend, to tell the stories of people that were suffering the most horrendous human rights abuses, but people that lived in parts of the world where justice and equality were foreign concepts. So that led me in the late 1990s to leave Australia, and I started off in the UK. And for a number of years there, I was doing some postgrad studies. I was working in a big law firm to pay the bills, and I was volunteering at a human rights agency. But I was getting frustrated because I was not getting any closer to serving the people that I felt I'd kind of been put on this planet to serve. It was kind of I felt, gosh, this sounds quite heavy and almost arrogant, but I felt like I was fated, that I was destined to help these people. It just felt like this huge magnet, this weight and this force that was pulling me. And so feeling a bit disenchanted and feeling a bit frustrated that I hadn't reached these people and what I felt that I was here to do, I took a 6-month leave of absence from work and I went on a community aid expedition to South America. And that was incredible. And that was supported by the British military. And I made some really good mates on that expedition. And one of them in particular was the one that opened my eyes to what a career would be like as a legal officer in the British military. And that seemed to be a really good means to an end. After doing a bit of research, I found out that the British Army was actively recruiting professional officers from Commonwealth countries, and lawyers, legal officers were some of what they were looking for in recruiting. And I would have the opportunity to deploy to places where people weren't getting help and humanitarian aid. And I would also have the opportunity to deploy to The Hague at some point, the criminal tribunals there. So I thought, okay, yep, I need to see if there is a way that I can leverage this vehicle to realise my career aspirations. So that's what led me to the British Army.
And that's what then led you to Iraq. And a fairly, I don't know how you describe it, Rabia, intense situation. If you're comfortable to share with the listeners about that hostage negotiation that you found yourself in and what happened in that.
Yeah. So I guess my tour of Iraq could be described as a tour of two halves. I was there for almost the whole of the year of 2005. And the first half of the year, it was relatively calm. We had a fair bit of freedom of movement. And so I was able to not only carry out my role as a legal advisor to the Brits and to the Allied forces, but I was able to also carry out my second role, which was to work with the Iraqi legal, judicial, law enforcement authorities to help them reestablish, rebuild, I guess, law and order in their country. But in about the June or July of that year, everything changed. There was this infrared technology that made its way across the border from Iran. And that technology was behind all the explosives, what we call IEDs, that were going off now up and down the country, killing thousands of innocent Iraqis and hundreds of military personnel. And so within that period of about 2 or 3 weeks, everything changed. And for the rest of that year, for the rest of my tour, it became quite terrifying. People were dying by the hundreds every day. We were losing our colleagues and mates. And just leaving the front gates of your military base was an exercise in, I guess, taking your life into your own hands. So I guess that's the part of the tour that I'd like to take you to, that second half, that really sort of terrifying part of my time. And so it was on the 19th of September of that year, 2005. And I'd arrived at my office at Basra Airport early that morning, as I usually did. But on this morning, we got news that 2 of my colleagues, 2 British Special Forces soldiers, had just a couple of hours previously been illegally kidnapped and beaten. And they were now being detained at a place called Al Jamiat in Basra City, which was a police compound. It was actually the headquarters of the largest Iraqi police service in the country. But at this stage, it was also now the headquarters of the Iranian-backed terrorist group that were behind a lot of the explosive attacks, because they had completely infiltrated the Iraqi police service. So at this stage, you had a situation where the terrorists were essentially policing and governing and running the country. So when we heard that our 2 guys were being held there, we knew that that was bad news. And I knew something additionally about Al Jamiat, because by now the situation in Iraq had got so terrifying that the Red Cross had been forced to pull out. And so the British government had appointed me as their, I guess, proxy human rights inspector. So as part of that role, I was responsible for conducting unannounced visits and inspections on facilities around the country. And I knew having done a number of inspections of Al Jamiat, that hundreds of innocent Iraqis were being held there and many of them were tortured. So this was bad news. This was really scary news that our guys were being held there. But this was not a scenario that I was trained for. So I just listened to events unfolding with a lot of concern. By now, before I had deployed to Iraq, I had been promoted to the rank of major. So I was a senior officer. That's the first of the senior ranks. And I had a colleague that was based at the headquarters with me. His name was James, and he was absolutely trained for this sort of scenario. He'd had hostage negotiation trainings. He was in charge of an intelligence unit. So he was ordered by our commander to go in to catch the helicopter with a group of his men to provide him with security, to go in and to do what was necessary to safely get our guys out. So off he goes. And about an hour later, he sends a message back to our headquarters explaining that the Iraqis had done something similar. They had sent their own representative in, a judge, as it so happened. And when he arrived at Al Jamiat, he made it clear to James that he had no interest in speaking to him. He wasn't going to have any sort of dialogue or negotiations with him. And when James said to him, well, who will you speak to, sir? He said to him, you send in the only one of you that's taken any time to sit down with us and to listen to our concerns and our fears for our people, to listen to our aspirations, and then has asked us how they can serve and help us, not like the rest of you who have stood over us and pointed the finger at us and told us what we needed to do and how to get it done. And so James is listening intently, and he said, absolutely, sir, you tell me who that is and I will do everything to get them here. And so the judge said to him, you send in Major Rabia, which is what they called me, and I'll speak to her. So with absolutely no hostage negotiation training, with no experience in this sort of a life and death scenario, my commander had no choice. So he ordered me to get on the next chopper, to fly into Al Jamiat and to take over from James and to lead what we now understood to be pretty serious hostage negotiations. You can imagine I was absolutely petrified. I was shaking in my boots, quite literally.
That would be challenging, Rabia, I would imagine.
It really was.
Yeah. And it's not the kind of workplace scenario where you can just say, no, sorry, I quit, I'm out of here. I imagine there was no exit strategy for you in that moment.
No, there was no room for me to go, yeah, nah.
I'm not up for it today, thanks.
No. So, you know, I remember at the time all of these thoughts racing through my head, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, my boss has got to be on drugs. I am the worst person you could send into this position. I'm going to get the guys killed. I'm going to get James killed. I'm going to get myself killed. I'm going to single-handedly bring down the Iraq campaign. You know, I was a bit prone to extreme thinking, but you can imagine the fear, the terror was genuine. And, you know, that's when I can't explain it. You can call it divine inspiration or whatever you want, but that's when in that moment my dad's words just popped into my head. And Dad was quite a wise man, and he used to say to my little brother Adam and I as we were growing up, he used to talk a lot about character, big word. And Dad used to say to us, you know, kids, there'll be times in your life where you'll be called upon to step outside of your comfort zone and to do something really hard, really uncomfortable, but for the greater good. And the decisions that you make in those moments at those times will define your character. And I don't know from where or why those words came to me. They hadn't meant a lot to me growing up. You know, when you're a kid and you haven't really lived a life, those kind of words of wisdom don't have a lot of resonance. But when I needed to hear it the most, they popped into my head, and I finally understood what Dad was talking about. And it was exactly this scenario. So I had to take a deep breath and I had to suck it up, and I had to do what was being asked of me, because like it or not, the lives of my two mates were now on my shoulders. So I raced for the next chopper and I was choppered in. And by the time I arrived at this place, Al Jamiat, there was now a couple of hundred locals that had surrounded the compound. They had been told that Israeli spies had been captured and were inside, so they were now screaming for blood. and they were firing their weapons in the air because everyone in Iraq is armed with rifles. And just before I arrived, about 100 British soldiers, 100 of my mates and colleagues had been sent to try and keep the crowd calm to stop a riot from erupting. So I got out of the chopper and I was trying to weave my way through this pretty angry crowd who were now throwing rocks and glass at our soldiers. And I got to the gate eventually where James was waiting for me. And I knew all was not well because he was as white as a ghost. And he took me into the compound where the judge was waiting. The judge and I greeted each other in Arabic. And then the judge turned to James and said to him in sort of pidgin English, "Okay, you go now." And I didn't want James to go. He was my, only security blanket. So I was able to eventually negotiate and get the judge to reluctantly agree for James to stay. But the compromise and the condition was, yes, he could stay, but he had to keep his mouth shut. And we could live with that. I just needed him there. I needed his presence there to feel just a little bit safe, if that makes sense. So then the judge and I continued to speak, and it took a while, but eventually he agreed to then take me to the cell where our two guys were being held. And all the while, as we're negotiating, there's probably about a dozen, maybe 15 of these terrorist coppers standing around, looking quite menacing. So we're marched down the other end of the compound and we come upon this stone cell that had a big metal door, and the doors open and we're sort of ushered inside, and I look around the cell and it's quite dark, and there's just one little tiny slit of a window that has the sun beaming in, which is providing the only light into the cell. And then in the far corner, I eventually see our guys, and they're beaten and they're bloodied, but they're alive, and their hands and their feet are in chains, in shackles, and they have hoods over their head, which is in breach of all the international conventions. So immediately I ask for the chains to be removed and the hoods taken from their heads. So that happens, and when the hoods are taken from their faces, they look around and they see the judge and they see the coppers and they see James, and they give him a nod of recognition, and they see me and they recoil in surprise. And I know that they were thinking, holy cow, if she is the secret weapon and the best we've got to look forward to, then we're truly stuffed. And I remember having quite a bit of sympathy for that sentiment, but all I could do was, give them a nod and sort of say, yeah, sorry, I'm really sorry, guys. This is it. This is the best. And I'll do my best. So now at this stage, we're in the cell with these two Special Forces soldiers, and the guards are all standing around, and the judge and I start negotiating for the terms of their release. And so what's agreed is I will take a set of actions. I will agree to meet a number of conditions, and in return for which the judge will then release the guys into my custody. So this takes probably a couple of hours to agree each condition, some of which, was outrageous that I wouldn't agree, some I agreed. So this process takes a couple of hours, and I'm furiously writing our agreed terms on what became a release contract, this scrappy bit of paper. And we get to the end of this process, and the judge and I are literally about to sign this scrappy bit of paper that turns into the hostage release contract. And at that precise moment, all hell breaks loose around us. I can hear rocket-propelled grenades going off in every direction. I could hear what sounded like glass smashing everywhere. I could hear screams coming from outside. And I look up and I look at this little cell of a window, and I could see flames. And the flames were so overwhelming and ferocious that I could even feel the heat coming from the flames outside. And what I didn't realize until much later is that the flames outside were actually the flames of my mates, the British soldiers, on fire, because the crowd by now had grown to over 2,500, and they were now storming the compound, and they had set fire to the soldiers. And so at that stage, within about 10 seconds of all of this happening, what sounded like a herd of 1,000 elephants as the crowd broke down the final wall to the compound, when I heard that sound, then suddenly inside everything changed. And the guards, who were terrorists, grabbed their rifles and cocked them and pointed them at us. And our two colleagues, the two soldiers, were thrown back into the corner and their chains and their hoods were replaced. And James and I were dragged out of the cell by the scruff of our necks. And the judge, looking around at what happened, shouts at me as I'm being dragged out, "I'm sorry, Major Rabia. You and I, we are no longer in control here." He says this in Arabic. And he grabs his papers and he puts them in his briefcase. And he turns around and he runs out of the cell and runs past me and runs away, and I never see the judge again. And so James and I are then dragged down this corridor to the other end of the compound, near where we had started, and we're thrown in a cell. And so now there's the two of us in this secondary cell. And there's about 15 or 20 new terrorists and these shady coppers in this cell where we are. And we're just standing there. We're left to stand there with them jeering and staring at us. And then within about half an hour, the door to our cell bursts open and 4 guys are thrown in with us. They were actually British SAS soldiers. In the chaos, they had sneaked in and they were hoping that they could grab us and get us all out. But unfortunately, they were caught and then they were thrown in with us. So now in this cell, there's now 6 of us that were being held. And obviously, I'm the only woman. I'm the only one that speaks a bit of Arabic, and I'm the only one that had Muslim heritage. All of those things up until that point had helped me with my tour, with my service. But now in this cell, being captured by the people that we were in the hands of, all of those things ended up making me the prime source of interest and the prime target. And I could hear what was being said by our captors, and they were saying, that I was the biggest traitor of them all and that I was the dirty whore. And that's what they called me for the rest of the time. And in that cell, in front of my 5 colleagues, for the next 8.5, 9 hours, I was degraded, I was humiliated, I was tortured, until miraculously we were rescued in a combined American-British operation. And it was a miracle because they got to us in the nick of time, not just the 6 of us in our cell, but we also got to the 2 guys, original guys that had been taken elsewhere just before they were about to be executed. So all 8 of us were rescued and managed to survive.
Wow. It's hard to know what to ask after that, isn't it? Gosh.
And how do you process something like that, Rabia? It's just so intense and so...
Yeah. Well, you don't. The answer is at the time you don't.
No.
You're living from second to second, minute to minute. There are things that happened in that 8.5 hours which I don't share because they're too traumatic. But the one thing that I have spoken about in the past is at one point, someone from outside bursts in and he's screaming and he looks at us and he looks like a crazed animal and he sees me as the only woman. And he screams out that I'm a traitor, and then he screams, "God is great, Allah Akbar," and he points his rifle. He cocks his weapon and he points his rifle to my head. And I remember at that moment thinking, "That's it. This is the end." But I also remember feeling so enraged and this sense of not just survival, but fight come over me. And I was frozen. I was absolutely paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound with my voice, but all I could do was use my eyes. And I remember at that point, so this is probably about 3 or 4 hours in, and And I remember I just looked at him. And I remember being brought up with, fairly Eastern philosophies about the eye as, the window into one's soul, and the eyes are the very spiritual part of our bodies and can convey so much. Love, power, hate, strength. And I remember just looking at him because my eyes was the only thing I could control. And I just looked at him in the eyes, and I remember thinking, all right, you bastard, sorry if I can't swear. Uh, if you're going to take my life, you have to look me in the eyes, and you have to look into my humanity, look to my heart, look to my soul, and then see if you're going to murder me in cold blood, because I come with love. I'm not your enemy. I'm not your enemy. And I remember saying that in my head, I am not your enemy. I'm one of you. And I just looked at him. And for a moment, he hesitated. And I can't explain this to you, Scott and Sam. I can't explain what happened next. But in that moment of hesitation, the head of the group that were holding us captive, so essentially my enemy, one of the terrorists, grabbed him and wrestled him to the floor and took his rifle from him. So in that, moment, in that twist of fate, my enemy ended up saving my life. And I will never know for sure why that happened. But if I was to hazard a guess, and the sense that I've made from it in the years since, is that maybe that instinctive primal moment of defiance and strength and humanity may have been enough to have had an impact, even if it was just not to shoot me dead that day.
Yeah. Wow.
So, it just goes to show that humanity still exists, even in the most extreme conflict situations.
And I imagine after that, you would go back to England, be kind of a hero for all the things that you'd done, how you'd put yourself out there way beyond what was expected of your role. That's not what happened, is it?
No, I had no desire to be a hero, but I also didn't expect what happened next. So we returned to our headquarters in the early hours of the morning once we were rescued, and all of the headquarters staff, a few hundred of them, had assembled in the headquarters building to receive all 8 of us. And all 7 of the guys that had been held hostage that day were ushered into the building to receive a hero's welcome. Lots of cheers and applause and handshakes and back slaps. And then they were immediately sent for what we call in the Army debriefing, that we would call trauma counselling, which is standard procedure. So they disappear, and I'm wondering why I'm being told to hang outside. And then a junior officer comes out and says, "Oh, Major Siddique, you can come in now." And I thought, oh, wow, gosh, I'm getting my very own personal welcome. That's pretty amazing. And I'm ushered in, and there's complete silence. And there's no cheers, there's no applause, there's no handshakes. My commander comes and greets me in very British fashion with a cup of tea. He then gives me a peck on the cheek and he hugs me, and he'd never done that before. It's not the done thing in the military. And he does that in front of all of the headquarters staff, probably about 80% of whom reported to me, because keeping in mind I'm a senior officer, so I'm in a command role. And he then says to me, "Siddique, you must be awfully tired. Run along back to your tent and don't hurry in this afternoon or tomorrow." So I receive no handshake. I don't ever receive any counselling, and I receive no acknowledgement for the role that I had been ordered to perform by him many, many hours previously. But nor do I receive any recognition for what I had endured in front of 5 of my colleagues for almost 9 hours. And my boss knew, because he'd been briefed before we arrived back home, what had happened to me and to us. And let's just say from my physical state, it was pretty clear what I had gone through. And I couldn't understand it. I was so confused. I was so confused that in the days that followed, nothing was recognized. There was no acknowledgement. There was no recognition. I was like persona non grata, and I could not understand what had I done to deserve that treatment. And as you can imagine, those feelings of confusion eventually gave way to feelings of anger and betrayal and abandonment. But the reality was that I still had a couple more months to serve in Iraq, and I had to suck it up. Everything that I was feeling was still nothing in comparison to the people that I was there to help and to serve, who were going through, horrors day in and out. So I had to put that to one side and I had to suck it up and soldier on. And I did the best way that I could, and I tried to keep doing my duty the best way that I knew how until I was then eventually returned to the UK at the end of that year. And what I didn't realise is that because of everything that I had gone through, not just what I'd been through as a hostage, but actually more significantly, the way that I was abandoned, ignored, betrayed, neglected, I returned to England broken. I was a shell. And I didn't realise how badly broken I was until many months later, until a whole lot of other things happened to me. And then I just collapsed to my knees one day and I didn't want to live anymore. And I was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, which is probably unsurprising. And after the long journey back from that, from rock bottom, after getting the care I needed, after being able to heal, after being able to rebuild emotionally, mentally, psychologically, I realized that what had happened to me was wrong. It was unfair. It was a great injustice. And I needed to right this. And I wasn't seeking hero status. I wasn't seeking medals. I wasn't seeking honor. I just wanted what I had gone through that day, how I had acquitted myself in the duty and the role that I'd been ordered to perform. I just want that reflected in my, they call them OJARs. It's like a performance appraisal, a report that you get every year that goes towards, your promotion prospects. I just wanted reflected in that, nothing more. But for some reason that was refused. And so for the next 2 years, I exhausted every avenue of redress, of complaint, of grievance that was available to me. And at every juncture, the door was slammed in my face until there was only one avenue of justice left. And that was really, really extreme. And I knew if I took it, that would mean the end of my military career. But by this stage, I felt that I had to, because I realised that what was happening to me was actually discrimination. That this was pure textbook institutional discrimination. But for the fact that I was a woman, that I was a Muslim, that I was a foreign officer, I would not have been treated this way. And that wasn't cool. That wasn't right. That wasn't just. And, I was a senior officer and I had influence and I was a leader and I had privilege and I had a voice and I had position. I was educated, I was articulate, I was a lawyer, for goodness sake. So I remember thinking, if this is happening to me, goodness knows how others are being treated that don't have the privilege, the position that I have. So I have to finish this. I have to take this last step and hold this institution to account. And so eventually that's what I decided to do.
Obviously you are a super courageous person. Like you've put yourself out there, you've taken up these amazing challenges. Some of them haven't been your choice, but you've stepped up and you've done your best. But I also think it must have been incredibly courageous for you to take a stand against an institution like the British Army. Like, what an opponent.
Scariest thing that I had ever done up until that point. To decide to mount a discrimination case against the British Armed Forces, which basically meant that I had to sue the British government. You don't wake up one morning and say, I reckon I'm going to sue the British government. That took months of soul searching and agonizing. And I had to be truly, truly confident that there was no other avenue left, that I was very clear of my motives, and that I had the support and I had the strength and I had the clarity of my values and my purpose before I went down that path. So that took a long time to come to that decision. What can I say? I don't think I could have lived with myself had I not.
Mm. I'm wondering about that. I guess I'd call it the inner conflict,
Mm.
of how to
Mhm.
work with that and manage that and get it to a point where you did make that decision, knowing that there would be significant impact.
Yeah, yeah,
And I guess it's also the impact if you don't do it too, isn't it? And I guess that's the other component.
absolutely. You've
Mm.
nailed it, Scott. There was huge inner conflict that I had to wrestle with and resolve. The knowledge that I'd be throwing away my military career that I loved, that I was proud of. Um, the conflict that I knew that I was going to set in play what would become a very difficult, lonely journey, challenging. It would take every ounce of my grit and strength and determination and resilience. But on the flip side, wrestling with the knowledge that I knew that I would regret it, that I would have regrets if I didn't take this step, that I wouldn't be able to live with myself, that I would always ask, what if? So it was really having to work through all of that inner conflict and come to a decision that I was at peace with, that I knew that I would not regret, regardless of what the ultimate outcome would be. And I knew I had to fight. I knew I had to fight the fight, not just for me. It was clear at this stage that there were hundreds of other people that were going through or had endured something very similar. So I wasn't just doing it for me now. I was very clear I was doing it for those that didn't have the wherewithal, the resources, the voice, maybe the clarity, the education, and the support that I had. So this was not just my fight anymore. And I feel so privileged and so blessed that I was able to work through that inner conflict and to be able to make that decision. And everything that I feared and everything that I had to work through came to pass. It took 18 months for that to eventually get to court. And I went to hell and back a number of times during that period. And it was horrendous and it was lonely and it was testing. And there were times where I asked myself, what on earth am I doing? And what am I doing to myself? But my values and my purpose were so strong, I guess much like when I was, a teenager and I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I guess that's what I have always been grateful for, that I've had such clarity around what my essence, what my core is. And that kind of kept me on north, and just having faith and believing that I was doing the right thing and that what would be as long as I threw everything at it and did everything that I could. And what came to pass was 18 months later, the case came to court and I succeeded. And that was pretty phenomenal, because I didn't realize that my case had become quite a prominent case. And there was the world's press camping in the court building, waiting for me to arrive and for the case to be brought on. And when the case was decided and resolved and when I succeeded, that opened a floodgate of massive, massive movement and change. Hundreds of cases then quickly followed mine. There was a public apology and recognition that I had been wronged and that serious lessons had to be learnt. There was an independent investigation into the armed forces, which led to profound changes in policy and legislation, and importantly, in time, in attitudes and culture towards women, towards ethnic minorities, towards military personnel that were suffering with post-traumatic stress and moral injuries, as they call them. And happily, there was also a change in the way that women on the front line and as first responders were regarded. So I think it was about 6 or 7 months after my case, the first woman was awarded a military cross for her bravery in a theatre of conflict, which is what James, my colleague, was awarded the day that I was handed my gag order, never to speak of the role that I had performed. So, I think for me, the biggest gift that journey gave me was the realization that we all have power and capacity to change things for the better. I talk about the power of one and the ripple effect that we all have. And that single lesson has and will stay with me for the rest of my life, and has and will help me with all future conflicts and challenges and curveballs and traumas that life will throw at me.
And I think the thing that stands out to me is that you weren't just doing it for you, you were doing it for all the other women who had human rights abuses essentially imposed on them by their own service.
Yeah, I was doing it for women, I was doing it for ethnic minorities, I was doing it for those that had suffered the invisible injuries of war and conflict, because post-traumatic stress was not something that was being accepted or supported or even reported about back then. And, I was also doing it for 9-year-old Rabia, who had never got justice.
Yeah.
Enough was enough, and I wasn't going to be silenced again. Not this time.
What was it like for you afterwards? Once the press died down and things settled again, how did you feel? It must have been almost a funny come down after all of that.
Well, you would think so, but life went from chaotic and dramatic to challenging and exciting, because at this stage I had been headhunted for a new role, which was an incredible role that I performed for a number of years, and that was as a terrorism and war crimes prosecutor, as a Crown advocate for something called the Counter-Terrorism Division. So for the next few years, I worked in England and also in The Hague and other areas prosecuting war crimes, terrorism offences, hate crimes, piracy, hijacking offences. So that was an incredible honour, and very, very meaningful work. Quite, traumatic, stressful work, but really important work at a time when, we were prosecuting the London bomber, where we were still chasing down people like Radovic from the Bosnian War, where they were still prosecuting offences from Rwanda, from Iraq, of course, and also it was only a few weeks before my case went to court that I discovered that I was pregnant with triplets. So pretty much as soon as the case was decided and I was able to finally process that and get some peace after that, I was preparing myself for what became the biggest ever challenge and joy, which was being a mum on steroids. And, having these little triplets, these little miracles, these tiny babies that I would soon give birth to, whilst also, doing this phenomenal role that I had been selected for. So life just continued to be incredible, amazing, next level, full on.
And not only that, Rabia, you've won many accolades for your humanitarian work. And I wasn't sure if Sam knew, but we have both won the same award.
We have.
It was actually Breakthrough Speaker of the Year. And I must say, watching you speak, Rabia, at a Professional Speakers Australia conference, I was really blown away by, I think you're the most powerful speaker I've ever met. Truly, because I think it's so authentic. And, I just, I love how you're so aligned with your purpose and your values, and that sort of comes across as well. anyway, we're pretty much equal, is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, absolutely, mate.
No,
Well, seriously, what you do, what you both do and what you do, Scott, um, demystifying and having real conversations and helping people with conflict, my goodness, isn't it more important than ever when we see what's going on in the world?
Yeah.
We
yeah,
have lost the ability to disagree respectfully and with
Mhm.
humanity.
Mhm.
And I think if there is anything we can teach our kids, it's that.
Yeah, absolutely.
and and how do you go with your kids in conflict, actually, talking about the triplets?
Oh, oh, I'd love to say that every day is a do as I say and as I do lesson, but I would be lying. Um, Look, they're my three miracles. I'm so fortunate, but my three miracles are also now three smelly 16-and-a-half-year-old grunty teenage boys. Um, so it's been an absolute joy, and honestly, all jokes aside, they have become my new inspiration and purpose and reason for continuing to do what I do and serving and helping and advocating in the different ways that I do now, because I want to be the best role model that I can. And I want to show them that your values can be your guide all through your life. But it's tough. It's tough now. They're at that critical stage where, gosh, they're facing so many more challenges than certainly I think we did in the 70s and 80s growing up. There's the old social media, there's the 24-hour constant information that's coming at them. There's over sexualization, boys and girls, and what they see on the internet. So much more violence, so much more trauma that they get exposed to almost daily. So, how do you as a parent navigate that? How do you protect your kids from that without wrapping them up in cotton wool and raising them in a bubble? And how do you help them make sense of it? And I guess for me, it comes back down to the basics, which is role modeling, because it's not just what you say. It's what you do. It's how you love in the house. It's how you conduct yourself. It's how you nurture your relationships and friendships, because your kids are listening and watching all the time, not just when you think they are. So for me, it's always been about constantly coming back to kindness, to respect, to being open minded, to being grounded. And we have this expression that we talk about constantly in our house, which is nothing is better or worse, it's just different. And we embrace differences because that's what's beautiful in our world. So even between them, when they disagree or when we have disagreements, as you tend to do, particularly around this age, as they're individuating and wanting to become men, um, it's trying to come back to that and calling upon those things in the heat of the moment when it would be difficult to reach out to those things and to follow them and to enact them when tempers are frayed and tensions are high. So, yeah, doing my best, and I haven't always succeeded. I have failed a lot, um, and I'm very conscious that when you've been diagnosed with something like post traumatic stress, when you come from trauma and abuse, um, you can heal in some ways, but the scars are always there. And when life throws you another curveball, be it COVID, be it the breakup or breakdown of a relationship, be it a tragic and unexpected loss, those wounds open again. And you have to be very, very vigilant, of knowing what your triggers are and reading the signs and getting help and support quickly. And I know at times I haven't been the best at that. And thankfully, I think in my 50s, I'm much better at that. But, my kids have been exposed to some pretty tough stuff as well. And it's being able to hold space for them and hold us all through that and not to shy away from the emotions, to sit in them, to feel them, to lean into them, but to also know that there's safety in and amongst that and that we're safe and we'll get through this, and we'll be stronger the other side of it. And we'll be more empathetic and resilient and kinder, so that when the next curveball comes or someone does something that we're just shocked and we can't understand why they would hurt someone else or us that way, we can talk it through and we can feel what we need to and know that we'll move forward, because this too shall pass. So that's what I'm doing my best with.
You should really be a keynote speaker, Rabia, I think.
Wow, your boys are so lucky to have such a strong role model. Like, honestly,
Oh,
all the things that you've come through and your positive attitude and resilience, it's an incredible role model for 3 16-year-olds, for all of us, in fact.
thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for everything that you've done and
Thanks.
for joining us today. We usually ask a conflict pearl or some insight to share with listeners.
Mm.
You have shared so many already. If you had to pick one thing, one piece of advice for people in how to approach conflict in a good way, what would you say?
Yeah, I think if we're going to, we've talked about some big stuff. So I think if I was to bring it down to something really practical that has helped me on a day-to-day basis, take a breath. Take a breath, count to 5 if that helps, and just gather yourself. When you're facing a conflict situation, when you can feel viscerally your heart rate increasing, your blood pressure rising, that feeling of heat, your ears tingling, whatever it is, where that physical reaction comes at you and you're just about to get angry, or you're raging, or you're feeling completely assaulted or offended or insulted, just take a breath and ask yourself what's going on for that other person. And is this something that I want to fight and take a stand on, or is this something that there is some room for a little bit of empathy, compassion, and some calm conversation for? And I know that I haven't been able to do that until and unless I'm able to take that first step of just taking a breath. That's been a game changer for me.
And not only is that great advice for day-to-day conflict, as you've demonstrated, it can even save your life.
It can. Didn't think of it that way, but yep, it can.
Thank you, Rabia. Wow. I mean, you've lived all that. I just listened to it for an hour and I'm feeling a bit like, oh, I need to go and have a cup of tea and a lie down.
Yeah, me too. Me too. You relive it.
Yeah. You must be asked to speak about this a lot.
Yeah, I am. I've spoken about it a lot over the last 10 years, Sam. Which is why I'm trying to take a new direction now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I'll still be asked to speak about it, but there's only so much you can keep, telling the same story. And I get that it's a story that has a lot of resonance with people and can serve. So I won't stop telling it, but also I need to look after myself. And, reliving something like that over and over and over again. I think for me, I found it harder to do that over the last year and a half with everything going on in the world, which does make me rage and angry. And so I suppose in one sense it's even more important to talk about it, but I feel like I need to do more. And so now I'm working more in the area of building trust, working with leaders to build trust, because that's what we've lost. We've lost trust. In our leaders, in our pollies, in our institutions. And we've got to do something, because bloody hell, the world that our kids are going into frightens the heck out of me.
Well,
I just want to thank you for your time, Rabia. The word that comes to me for you and what you've shared is just inspirational. You really are inspirational. So we appreciate your stories, your honesty, your vulnerability, and thank you for your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me. It was a privilege.
it was an absolute pleasure. And to all our listeners, find some inspiration. There's so much in this episode, and keep on working towards a more peaceful future.
And until next time, enjoy your conflict.